me just say something about emergentism there, because a lot of people like this idea of emergentism, and that I think there's a way of thinking about emergence which is perfectly okay and fine, and there's a way of thinking about it which I think is quite suspect. And the idea that, you know, as you put components together in more and more complex ways, you get more and more complex structures with more that can do more interesting things. That's perfectly true. Build a computer. You know, as you put the things together, you can do more stuff. That's fine, as you say, if you assemble buildings and civic structures and so on, and roads, and eventually you get a city. And there's nothing mysterious about that. We can understand how it happens. We maybe can't draw a hard line and say now it's a city, when previously it wasn't. But yeah, it's just all there is to being a city is having enough of these sort of civic structures put together in the right sort of way, and it's intelligible. There's no mystery about it. How did it become a city? It wasn't that something extra happened to make it into a city. The trouble with thinking about the dodgy sense of emergence is the idea that when you get to a certain level of complexity, kind of new things pop into existence, that completely new features or new powers, new causal powers pop into existence that are not explainable in terms of the components. So it'd be as if you put together a computer and, you know, it could do all the regular things of the computer, but suddenly it got some extra power that you'd not predicted, and you can't explain, you know, suddenly it's, I don't know, it can levitate or something. There's no explanation for this, just that when you put enough computer parts together, the thing floats, and nobody has any idea why. Or that when you get a city of a certain size, maybe it suddenly starts, I don't know, it starts glowing or something, inexplicably. And all you can say is, when you put things together in a complex enough way, that happens, but we have no idea why. And that's very different from the other sort of illusion, which is that when you organize things in complex structures, you get, they can do more and more complex things, but it's understandable how that happens. Okay, you couldn't possibly design something to emerge in the second sense, because you can't predict it would happen. You just got to copy cases where it has happened. And the trouble with that sort of emergence is that it gives a sort of license to people to hang on to their belief in things, even though they can't explain them. So you say there's this extra ingredient, ingredient to consciousness that can't be explained in brain terms. No, it just emerges.
Yeah, I think. Do you think that type of thinking stems from the fact that quantum physics has suddenly shifted the way people think? Because I was talking to Michael about this, Graziano. We were discussing how much he dislikes the fact that the fact that we have no understanding of quantum mechanics and cannot explain how suddenly this becomes physical reality, that must have something to do with consciousness as well, because it's the only other thing that we know and just cannot explain, and he does not like to talk about it. Do you think that that's exactly where this emergentism view, the strong version of emergentism, kind of stems from? The fact that reality has been shifted since Einstein and a lot of the guys with quantum mechanics have changed reality for us.
It gives support to people who want to say, look, just something fundamentally new happens in brains when you get them to a certain level of complexity, something fundamentally new that we couldn't have predicted from the components, or we can't explain in terms of the components, occurs. You could have said the same thing about life. You could have said when you put biological components together in a certain way, at a certain point it becomes alive. And that becoming alive is something extra to it having all the components, the heart and the lungs and everything, and the skeleton and so on, all organized together. It suddenly acquires this extra function of life, extra feature of life, which gives it new powers. Now,
and even if you look at life itself, we also have such blurry lines when we talk about life. What do we really consider to be life in the first place?
But if you want to be an emergentist,
a fetus. At what point are we going to conclude? And that takes it into a very dark topic.
Well, if you're an emergentist, you're going to have to say that, you know, there is some point, I guess, at which this emerges. And, you know, where it didn't have it before, and then suddenly it emerged. And that, of course, is a problem with consciousness. Where does that emerge, both developmentally and across species? Which species has it emerged in? Has it emerged? We can look at the brain systems that a certain creature has, say an octopus. Do those brain systems cause consciousness to emerge? How do we know? We're not octopi. Octopi. Anyway, to come back to the quantum physics, I think people who want to take that view, they can, you know, say, well, and I suppose I say, well, look, that's just, okay, you're just introducing mystery there into how this happens. It just sort of jumps from one state into another with no prior physical explanation. And that's, and they say, but that's what's happening in physics. The physics, surely you accept that physics is a hard science. It's the hardest of them all. It's fundamental. And they're talking about weird stuff like this. So why can't we have weird stuff like this in neuroscience and so on? I can see that it's rhetorically it's a useful device, but I don't think there's any evidence at all that those processes actually that quantum processes have anything to do with consciousness, although some people think they do, or that consciousness is in some way analogous to them. I don't think they're at different ends of the spectrum, levels of complexity. Okay. I don't think that look, the brain, here's a nice one that Daniel, a nice example that Daniel uses. The brain is made of, how many billion neurons?
86.
80 billion. Pardon?
86, I think about 86 billion.
86 billion. Okay. Yeah. Now each of those is just, a little cell. It's not, not that much different from a yeast cell. So in a bowl of yeast, there's about 86 billion yeast cells. There's not, the difference is in how they're connected up, how they're interacting with each other. And that's the place to look in that massive complexity, massive connective complexity. That's the place to look for what separates the brain from the yeast cells, not in some sort of magical metaphysical extra that's somehow comparable to the things that happen at the basic level of physics. We're dealing with complex, evolved biological structures here, not with the basic physical components of the universe. And it's natural to think that everywhere we look in biology, there's immense complexity, and it's evolved complexity. It's been selected for its effects. Why think that it's any different with the mind, with consciousness? It's
and also
another very complex evolved feature.
You're also introduced to a problem of trying to then attribute consciousness to other beings, because now we have to look at certain beings and try to determine, is this being conscious? Is this one not? Michael and I were discussing, it was just about 3 days ago, we were talking about how trying to attribute consciousness to people also is very problematic, especially when you take into account psychiatric patients and certain psychiatric conditions. When you look at someone who's highly dosed on certain antipsychotics and the way they look less conscious, and it's easy to make an attribution that that person is less conscious than you are, to show just how much it functions kind of like a spectrum, how much we determine how conscious we really are. And I know, as you mentioned, Susan Blackmore, the more we conclude that we're having these phenomenal experiences, the more you're likely to then get stuck in a fixed false belief. And that's how she introduces delusionism, because then at that point, you're forced to then constantly conclude that you're having these experiences.